Welcome to today's lecture in the series on Elizabeth I's reign. Today we are going to examine Mary Queen of Scots, and how her presence, after 1568, threatened the stability of Elizabeth's reign. This lecture will be split into 3 parts. In the first section, we will examine why Mary was a threat to Elizabeth, and why she became a figurehead to Catholic plots. We will then examine a chronological account of the different plots where Mary became a figurehead. Finally, we will study the events leading up to Mary's execution, and why the difficult was such a difficult one for Elizabeth to make. Let's begin by looking at who Mary Queen of Scots was. Born in 1542, she was the daughter of James V of Scotland and the Catholic noblewoman Mary of Guise. Mary became Queen of Scotland only a week after she was born, since her father died in 1542 following the Scottish defeat against Henry VIII at Solway Moss. For the next 5 years, she was a pawn in an ongoing war between England and Scotland known as the Rough Wooing, since the main purpose was to force through a marriage agreement between Mary and Edward VI, despite both being many years of reaching maturity. Mary was therefore sent to the French court, aged 5, so to avoid this marriage alliance. There, she was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, who would become Francis II. Therefore, Mary might be known to history as the Queen of Scots, but she was culturally raised as a French princess. She very briefly became Queen Consort of France in 1560 until her first husband's untimely death. Mary returned to Scotland as a young widow in 1560. During her 12 years of absence from the Scottish court, the country had begun its own Protestant Reformation along Calvinist principles. The Scottish nobles who now ran the country had established the Presbyterian Church, and so treated this young Catholic queen with suspicion. Mary spent 7 years attempting to rule Scotland, during which time she made some poor decision, most notably her choice of second husband in Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who was her English half-cousin, and so like her had a claim to the throne of England. Their marriage was brief and Darnley was murdered by his Scottish enemies, but it did produce a son named James. Mary then decided to marry the prime suspect in her second husband's murder, a Scottish noble called the Earl of Bothwell, and this decision was the beginning of the end for Mary. She was forced by the Scottish nobles to relinquish the throne to her 18-month-old son and go into exile. It is for this reason that Mary arrived in England in 1568, causing a dilemma for Elizabeth that would span 18 years, since now she became a figurehead to all Catholic plots against Elizabeth. From 1568, Mary became a figurehead to Catholic plots against Elizabeth. This is because she was Elizabeth's closest blood relative, the great-grandchild of Henry VII through his daughter Margaret Tudor. Added to this, she was a devout Catholic who did not recant her faith when placed under house arrest in England. She was also an anointed queen, albeit a disgraced queen, and this meant she attracted the attention of foreign powers who wished to use her as a pawn in their games. Despite her bloodline, Mary was not an attractive figurehead to others. Her time in Scotland had smeared her reputation and resulted in wild rumors about her sexual affairs. She was also French, with a powerful Catholic noble family on her mother's side. This meant many moderate English Catholics preferred Elizabeth as an English Protestant queen than Mary as a foreign Catholic queen, with all the foreign threats that came with this. Let's now examine the different events that posed a threat to Elizabeth between Mary's arrival in 1568 and her execution in 1587. The first event took place in 1569, and is known either as the Northern Rebellion or the Revolt of the Northern Earls. It's the only real rebellion of Elizabeth's reign, and even so, was much smaller in number than previous rebellions. The rebellion was triggered by a political dispute between the Northern Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland and William Cecil and his supporters in court. Many historians believe it was primarily motivated by politics, since these two powerful earls felt sidelined from court politics due to their Catholic faith. Nonetheless, the rebellion began when both earls refused to respond to Elizabeth's summons and fled court. They lay siege to the northern city of Durham and performed a Catholic Mass in the cathedral. Mary only becomes relevant to the Northern Rebellion after the Duke of Norfolk becomes involved. The Duke of Norfolk was a significant figure in court since he was a blood relation to Elizabeth on her mother's side, because he paid nominal support to the Elizabethan settlement, whilst remaining like his father a powerful Catholic noble in the south of England. Northumberland and Westmoreland approached Norfolk with the offer that he should marry Mary, and then to persuade Elizabeth to name Mary as her successor. The plot became even more messy for Elizabeth when her court favourite Robert Dudley supports this notion, on the condition that Mary converts to the Anglican faith. When Elizabeth discovers these plots, she is utterly outraged. It was one thing to have members of the northern nobility conspire against her, but quite another for her cousin and her favourite to become complicit within these plots. Westmoreland and Northumberland were unable to muster more than 6,000 supporters to their rebellion, and many historians have argued that this was just the number of retainers they had on their own estates rather than true rebels with a cause. As a result, Elizabeth was able to send an army under the Earl of Suffolk to defeat the rebels, but they disperse and relinquish their hold on Durham without a pitched battle. At this point the Earls of Westmoreland and Northumberland flee to Scotland. Eventually Northumberland is discovered and executed. In total 400 rebels were hanged for their involvement in the rebellion, showing she could be as brutal as her father when she felt the cause was right. The Northern Rebellion was short-lived, and did not pose a credible military threat to Elizabeth. However, it did have political implications. Firstly, her maternal cousin the Duke of Norfolk fled court, disgraced, and would re-emerge 2 years later as part of the Ridolfi plot. Leicester was able to recover his reputation due to his close friendship with the Queen, but not without humiliation. As for Mary, she was moved further south and placed under stricter house arrest, as it became clear that simply her presence in England was going to prove problematic. The Northern Earls were not intent upon deposing Elizabeth, they simply wanted to use Mary to increase their influence as Catholic nobles, but in the plots to come, Mary would play a much more central role. The next plot came 2 years later, in 1571. This plot was to some extent a reaction to the papal bull of excommunication that had been issued in 1570. It was named the Ridolfi plot, after a Florentine banker named Ridolfi who funded the plot. A key ringleader was the Spanish ambassador called Guerau de Espés, who had been serving in Elizabeth's court since 1568. This therefore marks a clear deterioration in Anglo-Spanish relations. As part of this plot, Mary was supposed to marry the Duke of Norfolk, and then the conspirators were to place Mary on the throne, with Spanish military and financial support. Cecil was able to discover the plot through a developing network of spies and informants, and the ringleaders were arrested. The Spanish ambassador fled England and returned to Spain, severing diplomatic links between the two nations. As for Norfolk, he pleaded his innocence, but was found guilty of treason. Elizabeth was initially reluctant to sign his death warrant, but after considerable pressure from her Privy Council, she relented. This was also the first time that members of the Privy Council called for Mary's execution, something Elizabeth would staunchly resist for another 15 years. The next threat did not come for another 12 years. The Throckmorton Plot of 1583 was so named after an English Catholic who conspired with the new Spanish ambassador, called Bernardino de Mendoza, who had been at the English court since 1578. In a similar ilk to the Ridolfi plot, the main goal was to depose Elizabeth and replace her as queen with Mary. The plot was discovered by Walsingham's spy network, which had developed to a highly sophisticated level by the mid-1580s, and Throckmorton confessed the details of the plot under torture. As a result, Mendoza was expelled from the court, once again forcing Anglo-Spanish relations to deteriorate. Mary was then moved from where she had lived in Derbyshire, at Hardwicke Hall for over a decade, to a more secure location, in Staffordshire, under a puritanical lord called Sir Amias Powlett. At this point, there were calls from both the Privy Council and Parliament for Mary's execution, but Elizabeth refused to contemplate the notion without clear proof of her culpability. The most famous Catholic plot was the Babington Plot of 1586, not because of its severity, but because of Mary's apparent complicity. It was so named after Anthony Babington, who was a young Catholic conspirator, who had been recruited by a Jesuit priest. In the run-up to the Babington Plot, there had been several other smaller plots, all of which had amounted to nothing. However, this plot makes it to the history books due to a coded message that was found in a barrel. This coded message was discovered by Walsingham's spy network, and apparently acted as definitive proof that Mary had responded to Babington's correspondence, and given her assent for the plot to go ahead. This finally gave Walsingham Cecil, and the rest of the Privy Council, with the evidence they needed to convict Mary of treason. Whether the coded letter came from Mary, or was fabricated by Walsingham, remains an issue of historical debate. Let's now examine the events that led up to Mary's execution at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587. Ever since the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, the Privy Council had been in agreement that Mary was too great a risk to national security alive, no matter how much security was placed around her. However, Elizabeth refused to place her on trial without any proof of her guilt. She will have remembered all too clearly her own treatment, as a young woman, when she was interrogated following the Wyatt Rebellion. In a similar way, she had been made a figurehead in a dynastic plot, without playing an active part in the plot. She had been guilty purely by association. Therefore, Elizabeth had a personal reason to give Mary the benefit of the doubt. The other reason why Elizabeth was also hesitant to sign the death warrant of an anointed queen, even if that queen had been deposed. She was worried that such an action would act as a precedent and place her own position as queen under threat at a time when her enemies were circling. She also had religious reasons, as she strongly believed in divine right, and the natural order of being. She believed it was only for God to decide when a queen's reign should end. Added to this, Mary was her cousin, and to sign her execution warrant would make Elizabeth a kinslayer. Contemporary society believed there was nothing more abhorrent than killing your kin, or a member of your family. Finally, Elizabeth feared the political consequences of Mary's execution. Relations with Spain were at an all-time low, but Philip had yet to begin building up his Armada force. Elizabeth rightly believed that Mary's execution would escalate these tensions into full war. It is for these reasons that Elizabeth delayed making a decision for several months following the Babington plot. There was essentially a paralysis in government, as the Privy Council and Parliament stood united in their belief that Mary should be executed, while Elizabeth remained resolute in her refusal to sign it. Cecil, not for the first time, used the threat of resignation to sway Elizabeth, but even this did not seem to do the trick. Some historians have seen this as evidence that Elizabeth's government did not function well as a cohesive body, and that Elizabeth had a poor relationship with her most senior privy councillors. However, the council were able to survive the stalemate without a radical overhaul, which shows ongoing stability. Despite her initial rage, Mary's execution must have come as a relief to Elizabeth. By allowing events to play out how they did, she could absolve herself of personal blame and use her Privy Council as scapegoats. It also made the succession much easier. Now the heir to the throne was not a female Catholic, but a male Protestant. This is because Mary's son had grown into the Protestant King James VI of Scotland, who was a much more attractive prospect for the role of heir presumptive. Even still, Elizabeth refused to name James as her successor, hoping, perhaps, that the problem would resolve itself through default over time. Let's return to our overarching question of how did Mary Queen of Scots threaten the stability of Elizabeth's reign? Firstly, Mary threatened the stability because she was Elizabeth's closest blood relative. As the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, this meant she was a viable Catholic claimant to the throne. Over the course of nearly 20 years, Mary became the figurehead to a number of Catholic plots against Elizabeth, even though she was not an active participant in these plots. Her continued presence as Elizabeth's prisoner made her a threat. Finally, when Walsingham's spy network uncovered proof of Mary's complicity in the Babington plot, this caused a huge dilemma for Elizabeth. She did not wish to execute an anointed queen or blood relative, but her Privy Council placed her under considerable pressure to sign the death warrant. At this point, more than any other point in Elizabeth's reign, there was a temporary breakdown in government as the Queen and Privy Council stood in stalemate. It was only resolved after Cecil tricked Elizabeth into signing the warrant. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next lecture to learn about Elizabeth's style of government.